Good afternoon. I'm Chris SCHERER, Member Communications Director of the Society of Broadcast Engineers and the co-host of this month's episode of the SBE WEBxtra, the SBE chapter of the Web. This is a monthly SBE meeting usually held on the third Monday of the month. The SBE is the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals with more than 4,500 members, mostly in the U.S., but also around the world. The host of today's SBE WEBxtra is SBE Treasurer and Social Networking Committee Chair Kevin TRUEBLOOD. Hi, Kevin. How are you?
Hey, Chris, I'm good. Thanks for getting things started here this afternoon. And we're excited to talk about today's very timely topic, which is the low power FM service, which is about been around for about 20 years now. And as of March of this year, there are 1,999 stations that are on the air in the United States. And the reason why it's a timely topic is because the FCC has announced later this year a window for filing new applications for new stations. And we're going to be talking with two people who have been steeped in the LPFM service for many years, Michelle Bradley from RecNet, as well as Paul BAME from the Prometheus Radio Project. And we're going to get a history of the service, as well as some of the successes, some of the challenges, and some best practices for those who may be interested in getting a license coming up later on this year. So we're going to talk to them here in just a couple of moments. But first, Chris, as usual, has the member update. So we got to take care of some business.
Very good. This is your SBE member update for August 21st, 2023. In June, a new four-part webinar series began. It's called Basic RF for IT. The course is designed for newer engineers who may come from an IT or non-technical background and need some training on the theory and components involved in generating radio frequency signals, as well as the principles involved with respect to maintaining and optimizing operation. Jeff Welton of Nautel and Gary Cavell of Cavell Mertz and Associates are the instructors. Modules 1 and 2 are now available on demand. Module 3 streams live on August 31st, and Module 4 streams live on September 21st. Another new series begins August 24th. Back to Basics, Network Design and Configuration. The series will provide an understanding of the fundamentals required in the design of, implementation of, and support of an IP network and broadcast infrastructure in a real-time media environment. Part 1 will focus on the network architecture and design with an emphasis on ensuring performance and security. It streams live on August 24th. Part 2 will continue with a focus on configuration considerations with an emphasis on IP, addressing and subnetting concepts for efficient use of IPv4 addresses, but IPv6 basics will also be included. This webinar will stream live on October 19th. Also, you can access the entire library of webinars by SBE presentations on demand. For more information on these and all of them, go to sbe.org/webinars. That's webinars by SBE. The SBE Leadership Development Course will be held in Washington, D.C., October 4 through 6 at the headquarters of Radio Free Asia. The deadline to register for the course is coming up fast. It's September 5th. Don't wait any longer. Register today. The Leadership Development Course is designed to take technically adept people and instill in them the sound leadership, supervisory, and management skills they need. The SBE Leadership Development Course is equally beneficial for those who are already in management and for those without prior management or supervisory experience. Get more information and register now at sbe.org/LDC. The next chapter exam window for SBE certification is in November. The application date for those exams is September 8th. If you don't want to wait, or if a local chapter exam is not convenient for you or just not possible because of in-person restrictions, private proctoring is available. More information on SBE certification is online at sbe.org/certification. And that is your SBE member update for August 21, 2023. Kevin.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris. And excited to bring on our guest today and talk about LPFMs. And just a reminder that if you have any questions or comments as we go through, you are welcome to leave them right there in the comment section, the question section, and hopefully we can get to them as we go through the program. So without any further ado, let's bring on our guest today. We are bringing on Paul BAME, who's with the Prometheus Radio Project, as well as Michelle Bradley from RecNet. And I hope I'm saying that right, Michelle, because I know it's REC, but I want to make sure it is RecNet.
It is REC. REC Networks.
Okay. So I was trying to spell the whole thing out. Well, fair enough. Well, so let's kind of start from the beginning as far as where the LPFM service began. And I can pose this question first to you, Paul. So where did we begin with LPFMs? Because I know it's been around for about 20 years or so. And how many stations kind of were there at the beginning and actually got on the air?
That's actually a better question for Michelle, because she was there in the thick of it. I was sort of parenthetically involved. And there's a big debate about how many stations there were, depending on how you look at the St. Patrick's Day Massacre.
Okay, this is all news to me, so I'd be very interested to know like what happened there in the beginning and what that involved.
Well, because there is actually a story behind that, and the St. Patrick's Day Massacre refers to a date that was March 17th, 2003. This is when the FCC had to dismiss a ton of applications because when the LPFM service first started in 2000, it was like it is now, where there was no requirement to have to protect a third adjacent channel. Well, at the time, NPR and the NAB didn't want to have anything of that. So they went to Congress, and they were able to get through Congress the Radio Broadcast Preservation Act of 2000. And this was back in 2000. And they were able to get the president to sign a legislation that would require the FCC to provide, to require a third adjacent channel spacing requirement. And so the FCC had to go back to all the applicants that had already filed in the windows, because the windows were in 2000 and 2001. And by the time this legislation was enacted, we've already had a couple of filing windows. They split the first filing window into several windows because of the expected demand. And so the FCC had to go back and say, okay, we've identified all the stations, all the applications that do not meet third adjacent requirements, and you now have a window that you can make major changes. You could do whatever you want to try to resolve it. Well, a lot of them were deadlocked. They couldn't resolve it. So the FCC eventually, on March 17th of 2003, they dismissed hundreds of applications across the country because they couldn't meet the new third adjacent requirement.
So how many stations ultimately were able to go on the air after that?
I think I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but I think we ended up with about 800, if I remember that number correctly. I might be wrong on that number, but I think it was around 800.
So what were some of the takeaways from that? Because obviously that was that did not go as I'm sure anybody planned, but what were some of the takeaways from it? Because then there was another window that opened up, what was that, about 10 years later or so,
Yes.
So what were some of the takeaways in the next filing window that they had in creating more stations?
What happened was part of the Radio Broadcast Preservation Act, there was a provision in there that asked the FCC to do a field study on the impact of third adjacent interference from LPFM stations. And this was done by they had leased that out, and they had contracted that out to ComSearch, and the MITRE Corporation. Actually, it was the MITRE Corporation that they contracted that out to, and they actually set up experimental stations across the country. There was like 7 or 8 experimentals that were set up after that that were sitting on the third adjacents of these full service stations. And then so they were studied. There was also internal studies done, using different types of radios and stuff. There was a very extensive report that came out in, I think, 2005 or 2006, called the MITRE study, which pretty much said if there's going to be any third adjacent interference, it's not going to be that much, and it's only going to be fairly close to the transmitter site of the LPFM. So with that information in hand, The LPFM advocates of the time, including the Prometheus Radio Project, which was a much bigger organization at that time, they went back to Congress and they said, okay, look, we've got the study from the FCC. The FCC has pretty much confirmed that there's not going to be an issue with third adjacent channels. So the LPFM advocates were trying for quite a few years to get the Local Community Radio Act passed. There were several versions of this bill, and every year it had died in committee. There was a little bit of, there were other issues that were going on because right after the St. Patty's Day massacre, later in that year, we had Auction 83, which was what we called over here the Great Translator Invasion. That was where 14,000 translator applications were filed across the country. And there was a lot of issues around that. The FCC had to put a stop on the processing of those applications because there was a lot of suspected abuses that went on. There was one person who filed almost 1/3 to 1/2 of the applications were filed by a single person. So there was a lot of concerns. They put caps in. The broadcaster didn't like the caps. So there was a lot going on. And what eventually came out was the Local Community Radio Act of 2010. And the Local Community Radio Act of 2010 took into consideration a few things. It took into consideration the third adjacent channel issue. It took into consideration the issue with all the translators that were filed. And also, too, because there was a lot of talk, and I admit I was a part of it, that said that LPFM stations should have priority over certain translators that are rebroadcasting very distant stations, such as the ones operated, like, for example, by Calvary Chapel of Twin Falls. And there was, so there were those issues. Also, the FCC was also in response to the rural radio that report and order that came out in the mid 2000s. We started to see a big influx of commercial stations changing city of license and moving into more metro areas and threatening the LPFMs with displacement. So the FCC had put in, actually around 2008, a interim second adjacent channel waiver process. And because the interpretation of the law at that time says that the FCC, that Congress said they can't do anything with third adjacent, but there's nothing that's stopping them from waiving second adjacent. So they allowed certain stations to put in an STA, and it was a much more relaxed second adjacent. You were allowed to have interference within the second adjacent, but the idea was to keep the radio station on the air from displacement. It was in the public interest. So the Local Community Radio Act addressed all of those things, but the key thing was with the LCRA was that it relieved the third adjacent restriction, so that way third adjacent could be waived. It actually, they had to remove all protections. There were some additional precautions that were put in there. So in case there was interference, there was an escalated process to handle third adjacents. And since the LCRA has passed, there has never been a third adjacent complaint that I'm aware of as a result of the LCRA's change in the rules.
And these days too, they can get in on second adjacents too now, correct?
Yeah, they can get on a second adjacent with a waiver, and it's the same exact way we do translators. So you could use living way, you can use downward radiation, the depression angle studies. You can do what we call over here donut waivers, where based on the number of bays of the antenna, if the interference hits the ground but doesn't hit a house, you could still do it. Or the old traditional, your 60 doesn't come into my 100, so you're good. So we're good. So there were ways of doing the ways of doing second adjacent waivers is exactly the way that translators do it. And we were able to get that in, and that's what was able to get the 2013 window. And in that window, that was the big window because there was a lot of push from a lot of different or a lot of well-funded civil rights and media justice and public interest organizations were backing the legislation, first of all. And this was just the spoils of that, of all that work was the 2013 window. So there was a lot of work that was put into that. A lot of applications were filed. And we did have quite a few grants out of that one.
And around that same time, too, that's when that backlog of translators was approved by then. So by that window coming around, there was already a lot of those issues. So it was much more obvious what channels were available and what weren't.
Well, exactly. And
Oh,
also,
yes.
too, at that time, yeah, a lot of those applications were still pending. And part of the proceedings that came in after the passage of the LCRA also had to do with the processing caps that they put onto the translators. The FCC originally said we're only going to do 10 of these per licensee, and of course the big licensees like EMF, like Edgewater and Radio Assist, which was the guy in Twin Falls, they raised a stink about it. And so the FCC eventually increased it and said, okay, we're going to do 50 in the urban markets and no more than 70 overall. And then part of the LCRA, there's a section in the LCRA, it's section 5, that basically states that the commission shall license FM translators and LPFMs based on community need. So on the translator side, there was this whole process that was put in that the only translators that would be able to go in, especially in the core urban areas, were those that would not impede any future LPFM opportunities in an upcoming window. And this was before the October of 2013 window that they did this. And so there was a whole process behind that, and the translators had to make all these new showings that they've never had to make before. And by 2018, we finally got through all of them. And if I remember correctly, the auction that resulted from what started in 2003 netted less than $1 million.
Interesting. So, Paul, we've got a bunch of stations now on the air. By the time that second filing window kind of cleared up a lot of these issues and we got more stations on the air, what were you seeing stations that were on the air? What were some of the challenges that they were facing? Were they seeing, good signals? Were they getting a lot of interference? What was going on once they were actually on the air?
I think probably most of the issues occurred in the non-technical realm. Organizations change, little nonprofits change. Some of them run out of money. Some of them built on expensive tower rental and couldn't afford it. The person who's the advocate for radio in that group decides to do something else. I mean, there's a lot of those things were an issue. Technically, we saw a larger and larger hemming in of where you could relocate LPFMs as the translators moved into the same areas that the LPFMs were concentrated in. And that was one of the things. I haven't known of an LPFM to fail for that, but it's been difficult here and there.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about because there was a couple of LPFMs that I know that the one guy who was in charge of it, it was on behalf of a government organization, that the one guy who actually was in charge of administrating it left the organization, and they just kind of went, well, that'll do it, and they signed him off. And by then too, the grant money had run out, so they really didn't have a lot of incentive to keep him going. But I think I kind of understand where you're coming from. Somebody loses interest or something like that. But was there a lot of incoming interference that they were experiencing, that they didn't really understand, something from like a second market that was constantly giving them issues, like on a summer morning? I'm sure some of those, even full powered stations, deal with getting bleed over, but was that even more so for LPFM?
Well, it is because of the power disparity, right? Most stations have a lot more power, and so eSkip and Tropo, whatever, the various conditions can cause a lot of interference. Some LPFMs had to walk it back because they didn't have, after a big station did a change, they didn't have an option, and they had to go under. I haven't seen a lot of that. I've also seen, some, not a whole lot of stations who they're not really quite sure of how much interference they should be expecting compared to what they're getting. That's kind of a magic art of RF propagation anyway. But I suspect there are some who are taking more interference than they ought to, because as we know, some people turn it up. Probably some LPFMs turn it up too.
Actually, turn up the power.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's locked in a closet somewhere, and somebody cranks it up and went, "Oh well, nobody will notice it," kind of thing, until they get inspected.
And there haven't been
So,
many inspections.
so what recourse do they have? So, how easy is it for an LPFM? And either one of you can answer this. How easy is it for an LPFM if they're getting way too much incoming interference and they find something better? How easy is it for them to change channels?
It's not that hard.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I mean,
As
you
long as
can
there's
change
as
the.
long as there's a different channel available.
Yeah,
Oh, and
that's
that's
been the
easy. You just go
biggest
to
problem.
radio locator and find it, right? And we'll
Right.
get to that
Uh-huh.
more in just a
Oh, you
second.
just
But
find a
Well,
blank
not
spot
radio
on the
locator.
dial. Yeah,
what were you going to say? I'm sorry, Paul.
um, I don't know what I was going to say.
Oh, changing channels is fairly
Oh,
straightforward.
yeah, it is. Like other services, adjacent channels, plus 1, 2, 3, and 53 and 54 channels is pretty uh, really easy if those channels are
Yeah.
available. And then if there are other channels available, um, you have to make an interference showing where you make a decent argument that your proposal is going to reduce interference. Um, but yeah, channel availability is, of course, the big issue, especially for this upcoming window.
Yeah, so I know at one time there was discussion of increasing the power or allowing stations to go up higher in power, and I know that was a contentious issue. But where does that stand? Is that idea just kind of dead in the water, or where does that stand?
That I can speak on that because that's my petition for rulemaking. But right now, LP 250 is pretty much in limbo. Who's holding it back right now is the NAB. And the NAB, I am continuing to try to olive branch the NAB. I am actively trying to work with them to see if we can come up with some kind of a happy medium where we could make the LP 250 available to as many stations, especially the rural stations, as possible. A lot of their issues really, a lot of their arguments are, that really don't have much merit, where they say, for example, that 4.5 miles is not hyper local, but 3.5 miles is. That's one of their arguments. We have showed many of times where a large majority of stations, and I'm talking like all but 4, if they were to upgrade to LP 250, it would not cause any contour overlap into any existing full service station. So the claims of interference are just not there. They're not substantiated. And the problem right now is that because we have a deadlocked commission, the FCC is afraid to take in any controversial subjects right now, and a lot of the stuff that we're seeing right now is non-controversial. Everything these days out of the commission gets 4 upvotes. And I think after Ana Gomez is confirmed and she comes in on the commission, I think we might be going back to the old FCC that we're used to. And LP
So
250 at that time may have a chance.
So did I hear you say that right? That basically all but 4 stations of that are currently on the air. So of the 1,999 that I was talking about, all but 4 of those could go to 250 watts and wouldn't cause any issues.
No,
Did I hear that right?
no, I didn't. Yeah, I did not say that. Yeah, no,
Oh,
actually,
okay.
actually, we're finding that about 50% of the stations that are currently out there, and this was when RM 11909 was written about a couple years ago. We still had over 2,000 stations. I think we're down to like 1,970 right now. At that time, we figured that about 50 something percent of the stations that are currently out there could upgrade to LP 250 using the distance separation numbers that the FCC has kind of suggested that we use based on our previous defeats on this issue. This is the third time we've gone to the FCC on this. This is the fourth time that it's been even discussed with the FCC. The first time they did it themselves. And then there's others that could possibly do a channel change to accommodate the LP250. So, so basically out of that 70% whatever subset, we did a study and found that only 4 of those stations, if they were to upgrade, they would have actual contour overlaps. They're 40 going into the other station, into the full power station 60. And that's because the FCC, when the FCC first started LPFM, and this was before the Radio Broadcast Preservation Act, they had put in a 20-kilometer buffer zone around the standard contour sizes of every full-service station. So that way, the way the rules are written, LPFM uses distance separation, but a Class A station is considered, when they're writing these distances, it's considered at 48.3 kilometer service contour, not 28.3 like it really is. So they've added that extra 20 kilometers in there, and that helps the LPFM to prevent interfering with the full service station. It also prevents, in case the full service wants to make a very minor modification, it won't have much of an impact on the LPFM. That was kind of the mindset back in 2000 when they came up with this idea. And we still have it to this day. And the new proposal, the previous proposals, and this was the first one that came out by the FCC back in 2012, was to actually encroach that 20-kilometer buffer zone and allow LPFM stations to stay at their same distances and have the same distance separation numbers, but go to 250. And obviously the NAB and a lot of folks didn't want to have anything to do with that. We proposed that in a couple of the things. And then in 2020, when the FCC came out with the report and order in MB docket 19193, they said, no, we got to honor the 20-kilometer buffer zone. They interpreted the LCRA to require it. So I said, okay, we'll do that. And then so we came out with new numbers that honored the 20-kilometer buffer zone. So yeah, you need to have a little more space between an LPFM and a full service now in order to get LP250. And that's what brought the upgrade numbers down. And we knew that was going to happen.
What about separating themselves from other translators? Because I know where there's, or not other translators, but separating themselves from translators, because I know there's places where there have been, basically they interfere with each other, an LPFM versus a translator. How have those circumstances worked themselves out over time?
Well, with the translators, there's a disparity here because translators are allowed to use a contour overlap for spacing to everything, including to LPFMs, where LPFM is simply, it's just distance separation. A translator is considered a non-directional facility to an LPFM, even if that translator is running a directional antenna. This is an issue that we discussed back in RM 11810, where we said that the Local Community Radio Act's requirement that distance separation be used only applied to full service stations. And we were asking for the ability to be able to use contour overlap in respect to translators. So that way we could deal with some of the potential displacements, the interference and things like that, that was taking place. But the FCC didn't want to have anything to do with it. They wanted to keep LPFM simple.
So I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and ask Paul, you've been involved with the Prometheus radio project and actually getting a lot of these stations going. And we were talking before we got on the air about some of the stations you cite as success stories. So we've talked about some of the challenges and some of the technical challenges that stations have experienced in getting on the air and actually getting licenses. But what are some of the success stories that they've had with the service? Because certainly with as many that are on the air, there's ones that are on the air that are doing what was intended to the service. So can you point to some of those examples?
Sure. I mean, one of our favorite ones is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Immokalee, Florida, farm worker group. I think they're probably pretty famous by now. That was a round 1 LPFM, and they're still very active today. And nobody else is doing what they do on the air for the audience that they have. There's a similar farm worker. I don't know if they're similar. There's another farm worker organization up here in New Jersey that does similar work. They're an advocacy group, and they got an LPFM in the 2012 window, and they're able to provide programming in the languages that their people speak. And I just think that's wonderful. There are an awful lot of minority-controlled stations, and I mean, probably still not enough if you look at the statistics. But the minority stations, I think, have really brought an opportunity to bring different kinds of programming and different voices to the air. We've probably got, I don't know, a handful of stations in Philly, and I'd say at least 3 or 4 of them I would call African American run. And I think that's a good thing. Although there have been stations run by people of color, not that many, really.
Well, and I don't know if either one of you have a breakdown, because obviously by law they can't have, like, there can't be one licensee that owns, all the LPFMs or even half of them or something like that. But they're intended for the local community. So do you have any breakdown or statistics of what how many religious organizations or minority organizations, like you said, like, do you have any kind of breakdown to who is actually running these stations?
Actually, REC has been, I'm sorry for interrupting there. REC has actually been conducting those studies for a few years. And what we have found is, for example, the faith-based community currently has had at the time, the last time we did the study before the pandemic, was just over half. Just over half of the LPFMs that were licensed at the time were licensed to faith-based organizations, and then the remainder were secular organizations. There was a chunk there that was considered public sector government, a small section that was considered educational, both public and private secular. And so in there was a chunk of maybe about 30% or so that were what we would more likely call like a pure community station. These were stations that were operated by community organizations, by local groups that got together to start a radio station. Some of them are just run by a couple of beer buddies that said, "Hey, let's form an organization, start a station, and play some music and stay out of trouble." And that's what they've done. But the religious organizations definitely dominate at least half of the current LPFM ecosystem right now.
Interesting. That's I mean, it's interesting to see the variety of them. Like you said, you've got churches that just have a small little service, and then there's other organizations, and I am familiar with that Coalition of Immokalee Workers Station out in Immokalee, which, I mean, is super serving what is otherwise an underserved community by media in the area. So it seems like it kind of fits that bill. Do you see a lot of, I guess, are the most of them abiding by the rules? Have there been any issues as far as, because they're held to non-com rules, so have there been any issues with any of the licensees kind of running afoul of technical or any kind of other business issues?
I
Yeah, I
haven't.
would.
You can go ahead.
I haven't
You can start
heard
first,
of.
Paul. Yeah.
I haven't heard of that many that have run afoul of technical issues. Some have. Some were accidental, and but there have been some, sort of a steady trickle of LPFMs that have violated the advertising regulations. And I think the most recent one I know of was in Colorado.
Yeah.
And in those
I mean,
situations, they've kind of thrown the book at them, haven't they? They've actually, like, really fined them just to more prove a point.
I think the advertising is, yeah, don't do it. That's my advice. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't even take a chance at doing it. If you think you're doing something that might be questionable, then just don't do it. It's not worth the risk.
Sorry, what were you going to say, Michelle?
Okay, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, the issues that come in from LPFMs, and I was just looking at this I was looking at some of these statistics just earlier today in regards to the violations that have happened over the past 5 years. I mean, there's not been that many. The numbers are a lot lower than some might think that they are, but there are those out there that originally thought that they could make a profit off of these stations. And I remember after the filing window many years ago, I remember talking somebody into withdrawing their application because they thought that they were going to be able to make a profit off the station. And so obviously you do have a couple out there that don't understand, and they're out there doing their own thing, and and they get caught. And we saw what happened in Colorado. We've had a couple other cases. There's currently a big case right now that's still brewing out in was it Charleston, West Virginia? No, in Charlottesville, Virginia. That involves several stations out there. So there are those issues out there. The other issues are mainly technical issues. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll change locations and they'll forget to tell the FCC. And so we've seen that happen. People think you can just get up and run with these things. The problem is that these people are not reaching out for help. They think that they're on their own, but they don't realize there is help out there for them that can help guide them. And we have a lot of free information out there that can help LPFMs out there. And then even simple things like forgetting to file the renewal. We saw a lot of forfeitures come out after the renewals because the stations had just forgotten about it. And we're still, and we're trying to bring up the education on EAS and EAS compliance and participation in the national periodic tests. Right now, we're running about an average of about 45% participation in the annual NPTs, and I am very disappointed at that number. And I'm doing everything that I can to try to bring that up.
So it's
just
45% for LPFMs. Yeah. Well, now
right.
that's an interesting question because that was actually something I was just going to ask, because with LPFMs, they are required to have equipment. They're required to obviously abide by EAS rules, but they're different than what full powered stations are. Can you kind of briefly go over what the differences are?
That is correct. The big difference between the
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I was just going to say is that the LPFM stations are only required to decode. They are not required to encode, so they're not required to originate alerts, but they do have to forward things that come into them in accordance with the EAS plan. They are required to have an EAS. They are required to keep the software up to date. They are required to have they're going to be required to have the cap polling after December when the changes become mandatory. So that is a lot of it. And Paul, did you want to say something about EAS?
Not about EAS, but about the differences. I think that, this is an SBE audience, and I'm thinking that, there was a time when, not so much anymore, stations had an engineer on staff, or at least a chief operating officer. And those people would learn the EAS stuff. They would neighbor with the SBE chapter. They would learn enough to keep the station compliant. And that really takes money for staff. And that's not what the tiniest stations have most of the time. And then on top of that, there's turnover in staff. We're dealing with community groups. There's often turnover, and the new people, how are they going to know what they need to learn, let alone learn it? There are resources out there. Michelle has a great website, and we do too, where you can learn a lot of this stuff, but there is no real easy way, and it's a pretty heavy lift. I mean, if you think about the first time you learned about the nitty-gritty details of setting up an EAS unit, imagine, somebody who's, maybe a literature major coming into a position at an LPFM half-time, if paid at all, and they have to learn that. It's just, the system doesn't work as well for these sort of low-staffed stations as it does for ones that have a little more money.
There's also the costs involved.
That's true. And with the mandatory upgrades and things like that you have to do to EAS systems, that's something they don't typically plan for.
That's a huge hit for a small station, and especially with what's going on this year. This was one of the times where we actually kind of joined forces with the NAB to try to hold off the radio cap polling requirement for a few years because of this issue. Because of the expense issue, because you got one company out there that wants to charge anywhere from $500 to $1,000 to upgrade a box. Another company out there, the one that has the famous blue boxes, at least has a better deal where it comes to this upgrade. But still, getting these stations upgraded for something that really doesn't benefit radio was, we fought that, and we fought that as hard as we could to try to get the FCC to delay that for radio. It was okay for television, but for radio, where they don't see the cap data over the air, except maybe a couple HD stations. But that's you know, there was a lot of expenses involved, and just the overall expense of buying an EAS in the first place. That is a huge investment for a station, and especially when there aren't any lower cost options out there. And our attempts to try to introduce lower cost options have been shunned by FEMA and the FCC. And but we're still looking at ways of doing it, and we're still working. I work very closely with the FCC as alerting team, and I've worked in the past with FEMA. We are a FEMA developer over here. I do have a memorandum of understanding. We actually provide some EAS products out on our websites right now, and we got a pretty good relationship going with FEMA right now, which we're hoping to improve.
So going forward, the window is going to be opening later this year to get all new stations, and the big question on everybody's mind is how on earth are they actually going to find a frequency to operate on? So I guess that's kind of where we'll start. Is where realistically do you think, or how many stations do you think realistically could get licenses this year? That, I mean, rural areas probably will have more success than others, but do you see so far any interest in getting applications and actually being able to find available frequencies for those that are?
Definitely. People have been sort of steadily, even before the official announcement, people have sort of steadily been cold calling Prometheus with these questions. Now, as you might imagine, most of the questions come from the highly populated areas, and we usually have to give them bad news because the cities are tight and most of them are full. By the way, I want to put a shout out to the FCC. I hate, that's kind of weird, right? Their new channel finder for LPFM, you can search for LPFM channel finder, is actually pretty good. I'm thinking of borrowing some of the features for the one that I offer at Prometheus. It doesn't do every last little thing that it ought to do, but it does most of it. So if if you know people who are trying to find a spot, they're welcome to plug in their latitude and longitude, and it does a pretty good job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's something
Also,
that a lot of people don't realize is you can't just, oh, my frequency is open, this frequency, there's nothing on it in my area, and think that that's how you can get and apply for an application, but it doesn't quite work like that.
Oh my, I get a lot of those.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Also, too, another thing on that issue is, another thing is that we have people that come in with try to say, oh, well, I found it on Radio Locator, because they have a Part 15 search which does not apply the FCC rules. So we say, no, you got to use one of the regular tools out there. Mine, Prometheus's, now the FCC's. The other thing that's happened too, and this is kind of a little mini godsend to some of the urban areas and some of the suburban areas, is there was a change in the rules in regards to the reserve band. And this happened in 2020 in MB docket 19193, where the LPFMs used to be before, if there was a channel 6, RF channel 6 LPTV or full service station within so many kilometers of the proposed station, you couldn't do it. One of the things that I pushed for a few years back was to allow LPFM stations to use the same contour study that we use in 741205 for translators in the reserve band to protect LPFM. To protect channel 6 stations using the contour overlap method. The FCC says that they will accept that on a waiver basis with a showing, and as long as you notify the TV station that you're doing it. Also, the FCC will also accept letters of consent from the licensee of a Channel 6 station if you plan to put an LPFM on 88.1 and 91.9 that meets all other distance separation requirements except for the TV station. And I know that's one of the things that we've been working with. We have at least one major LPTV licensee in one of the major markets that has already pretty much agreed in principle to allow these LPFM stations to come in. And so that's, and I could probably see other ones happening, after they realize that these, under digital, there's not the same interference issues that we had from back in the days of the 1970s and 60s era TV sets with the manual tuners. And, the FCC had recently brought that up for discussion in MB docket 03185, where they were just talking about getting rid of the channels, the FM to channel 6 protections, but they decided to punt on it again. And this is like the umpteenth time that they've punted on this issue. And it's mainly because of one TV station.
Yeah, and that's a whole other thing where the whole decision about where Channel 6 lies. But our LPFMs, they are available in the reserved band as well as in the non-reserved band. You can get basically
Absolutely.
allocations wherever there's a channel available, or is there restrictions?
Whether there's a channel, if there's a channel available, then you can definitely get an LPFM in the reserve band. There are quite a few LPFMs already in the reserve band from the previous windows. After the DTV conversion, we saw a big drop in channel 6s. And of course, with the trend of everybody going to UHF because of the better antennas and the better coverage, the channel 6 is becoming more and more of a wasteland, both for full and LPTV. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities down there. And if anything, it's a little bit easier in some cases if you can get a reserve band channel, because if you're in like zone 2 where I am, or in zone 1 where I am, you only have to deal with a 60 dB class B instead of a 54. So that comes in very helpful where a second adjacent waiver comes into play. But at the same time too, you have the same protections, like you have the same protection requirements to class Bs down in the lower band as you do in the higher band. So it all kind of bends out, and we're definitely going to be doing some work in the reserve band in this window.
Well, and before I get into one question that I'm going to pose to the both of you, but are you seeing more of the same kind of applicants in this upcoming window as you've seen previously, where it's a good mixture of religious organizations and minorities and other community-based folks that are interested in these? Like, who's interested in stations that in the upcoming window that you've heard from so far?
I think that's a tricky question because different service providers are known to different groups of people. So we at Prometheus don't tend to have a lot of religious groups calling on us. Some, but there are other facilities for that. In fact, if you're with certain religious organizations, they have a staff lawyer to help you, right? The mothership has a staff lawyer.
So your data is skewed a little bit, is what you're saying.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. I'd say that over half of the cold calls that I've got are from potential stations of color. And there's at least one that's not, but is a very good community-oriented station. So far, I'm very happy.
And what about you, Michelle?
Over here, we seem to be getting about a 50-50 mix between faith-based and secular, because we're not we're a different type of, I'm a different type of organization than Prometheus is. Yeah, we are, we're an advocate, and we're national advocacy, but we don't have a specific focus on on community groups. We're more about access to the airwaves and the availability of spectrum. And so, we do get some attraction from the religious side, even though we are totally secular. But so we get a little bit of both sides. We get a little bit of government. We get a lot of, and a lot of things in between, and a lot of the folks that are not necessarily with very well-established organizations, but smaller groups of people or somebody forming a nonprofit just to start the station. And so we get a lot of those, kind of what we call the microstation type community. A lot of them come our way.
So as we start to wrap up here this hour, the question I was going to ask to both of you, and I'll start with you, Michelle. So a station wants to, there's actually a group that wants to put a station on the air. What would you recommend? Best practices? What things do they need to keep in mind going into the application window to actually realistically get a station?
Number one rule, always have hired help. That is the number one rule. We saw so many DIY applications in the previous window, and they crashed and burnt so badly. And if you do decide that you do want to try to DIY your application, know what you're doing. That's the key thing. A lot of people are not very aware of the rules. I would say even go beyond hired help. I would say get somebody who specializes in LPFM, because there are specific quirks about the LPFM rules. There have been some changes in the past 10 years that not the average consulting engineer may be aware of. We do have information on the REC website about what's happened in the past 10 years since the last window, so that way people can get up to speed with the changes. But definitely, I would say definitely get hired help and do drive testing. If you get the frequencies, do drive testing and do it at different times of the day. Do it in the mornings and do it in the afternoons, especially with the tropo and the other conditions that come in. Sometimes what you hear during, if you hear a clear frequency in the morning, it may be a noisy frequency in the afternoon. So you've got to be able to do that. We're kind of in sort of the peak, coming off of the peak of this current tropo cycle right now. So this is a good time to check. This would be a good time to check to see if a frequency, how clear a frequency is. Because remember, an LPFM station can come inside the interfering contour of a full service station or a translator. They just can't, obviously interfere. So there's going to be a lot of PFMs that are inside interfering contours. So yeah, they're very vulnerable to incoming interference.
All right, same question for you, Paul.
Yeah. The way I usually say it is, assuming that people have an understanding of what they can do with an LPFM station, which is maybe the step zero, first check if there's any possibility at all of a frequency that will cover any of the people you care about, because as we know, they're going to be tight. For anybody near an urban center, and I mean pretty far from it or between them, we're going to be looking at a lot of second adjacent waivers, and yeah, most of those people are going to need help. And then once the possibility of a frequency being available looks pretty sure, and we'll know on October 1st when the application freeze happens what's really available. The next thing is to get your nonprofit in shape, figure out which nonprofit you're going to use, be aware that there's going to be a competition. And a lot of applications will end up in MX competitions. And so there's going to be phases and phases. And, be aware that you might get a grant this year, or you might get a grant in a year or two. And that's kind of that's a hard thing to schedule, when you're trying to do a campaign, a fundraising campaign or something like that.
As far as getting the money, the timing of getting the money you need to build out the station, is that what you mean?
Exactly. Yes. And also maintaining the excitement of the organization, especially if it's one that's created just for the purpose of starting a station. A little bit easier for established organizations.
So timeline of getting things going, so if somebody wants to get a station on the air, when do they actually need to get going on it? Which I'm guessing the obvious answer is today, but if they haven't done so already, but when do they actually need to get those applications done?
The filing
well, you can start preparing them now, but the window is November 1st through 8th.
And then realistically, when would the licenses actually be granted? How soon would they be able to actually get on the air with it if somebody's itching to get on the air today?
The commission's
can
moving
speak to that.
faster and faster. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, and what's going to likely happen, and if this is same as the previous window, what we're going to probably see is we're going to probably see the FCC put out the list of mutually exclusive applications. The first list that will probably come out around December 15th or somewhere around there, about 1 month or about December 8th or so, about 1 month after the window closes. And at that time, that's when they're also going to start declaring the singletons, and they're just going to declare those through public notice, through the daily public notice, as they process them. Once they're processed, once they're published, then that opens the 30-day period for petitions to deny. And then once that 30-day period passes and there's no issues, and the FCC does a final technical administrative check on the application, it can be granted. We'll probably start seeing our first grants probably in early January, and then we can, and then they'll have 3 years to build.
Gotcha. All right. Well, for both of you, any final thoughts so far? I can start with you, Paul.
Final thoughts. It's an exciting opportunity. It's the third time in 23 years, I guess it is. So, if you know anybody who's maybe interested, this is the time, because we don't know when the next window will be. We don't know what the frequency availability will be for the next window, but it's likely to be worse. So yeah, if you know anybody who's interested, connect them with the resources they need to do this. Prometheus, Rec Networks, there's plenty of other service providers that do this. And get going now.
And for you, Michelle, any final thoughts?
Absolutely. And, even if you don't use, for example, REC for your filing, at least use our resources. And the resources are free. And there's a lot of information. A lot of questions have been answered from, the last 23 years. They're all up there. And so recnet.com is a great place to start. And I think the other piece of advice is that stations need to realize how much money they're getting in themselves into. This is not just simply, being able to plug in like a CB radio, put up an antenna and go on the air. There's a lot of expenses and a lot of things that are involved with the station. And what we saw happen in previous windows was the sticker shock finally kicked in, and the stations, the grantees just couldn't afford it, and they let their construction permits go because they just couldn't afford to put it up.
Yeah, that is definitely a concern as we get into it. They end up becoming money pits, and I know that's true for commercial stations as well. So, well, thank you very much, Michelle and Paul, both. A wealth of knowledge as far as the LPFM service, and huge resource. I know this last hour has been for people that are curious about the service or interested in the service. So this has been hugely informative. So thank you to you both for being on today. So as we wrap things up, we'll turn things over to Chris to close things out. And thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. This has been the SBE WEBxtra, the SBE chapter of the web. We present it monthly. We hope you'll join us each time. We'll post the replay on our YouTube channel within a day. If you hold SBE certification, viewing the SBE WEBxtra qualifies you for 1/2 point in Category G, that's attendance. It's just like attending a local chapter meeting. If you have an idea for a topic or a guest for the SBE WEBxtra, send it to us at webextra@sbe.org. And that does it for this installment of the SBE WEBxtra from the Society of Broadcast Engineers, the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals. Thanks again to our guests, Michelle Bradley of REC Networks and Paul BAME of the Prometheus Radio Project. And on behalf of Kevin TRUEBLOOD, we'll see you next month.